Sunday, May 27, 2018, GDS Entertainment proudly presents
Grooving on the Hudson.
That's right, Grooving on the Hudson. Memorial Weekend celebration. Music played by Road International. Selector Oxtail alongside King Shiloh International. All aboard the elegant Paddle Wheel Queens, One World's Fair Marina. Boarding 6 p.m. sharp from Flushing Queens Certified Shea Stadium. And Miss Marina will be selling 7 p.m. sharp. Also,
for tickets, People's Choice Furniture, Bronx, New York. Doris Restaurant, Queens, New York. G's Restaurant, Queens, New York.
Also,
WorldGymGlobal.com.
Also, complimentary dinner prize and surprises.
Come party with us.
Imperial Lounge presents a night called
Reggae Dancehall by the Beach. To be held at Imperial Lounge, 2 to 14 High Street, Margate Seafront, Kent, CT9 180. To be held on the first Saturday of each month. Your host DJ Matt. Also rotating DJs, Roddy Boone, DJ Happy,
and Younger General.
Doors open 8 p.m. till late. Free entry all night. Music policy, reggae, dancehall, and a touch of soul. On the first Saturday of each month. Reggae Dancehall by the Beach. At the Imperial Lounge Margate. Do remember, you can also get VIP and Shisha booking. More info on the World Jam Global website. That's www.worldjamglobal.com. Also www.imperialloungemargate.co.uk.
See you there.
It's the right thing you doing. 1, 2, 3, swing it.
Do you have an old sound tape or your favorite cassette tape that you want converted to CD or MP3 format? Do you need a demo CD, radio ad, a DJ, or even a sound system for your wedding, birthday, or special occasion? Then why not get in contact with KTR Records on 07931 152 448, or check out our website on www.ktrrecords.com. We have been in business since 2004 and also undertake community projects. So for your remixes, dubplates, and all your sound editing needs, why not contact KTR Records, official sponsor of World Jam Global Radio. KTR Records, coming your way.
My time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. In the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about beat no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime.
Well, I want to say a big good evening going out to all of you.
Already did my time, I paid for my crime.
We are live. This is World Jam Global Radio. My name is Kirby Julian and we're on Issues today. I want to give a big welcome to whatever part of the world you are.
proud of what I had.
We are now going out live on every social media platform. Get us live on www.worldjamglobalradio.com. Or you can find us live on Facebook Live.
I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb. My brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and
share it around. Share it, share it, share it.
Real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
Today we got my special guest.
Right now, he could be facing life in prison.
The president of the National Association Against Police Brutality, legal scholar and former law enforcement officer Jonathan Newton,
did my time.
And a former chief of police and author Jerry Summers.
Time, paid for my crime. Already did my time.
And I'm going to be introducing them both very shortly as we discussed qualified immunity.
I paid for my crime.
Stand by.
Did my time. I paid for my crime. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game has been rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do. That's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent, I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chump. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters. Already did my time, paid for my crime. Already did my time. Already did my time. I paid for my crime. Already did my time.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be facing life in prison. Prison.
Wow.
As said on the intro,
trying to cope
with police brutality at an all-time high, police corruption at all levels, and innocent people still being convicted and or killed with no consequence. We ask some very important questions today from those who should know most. My guest today, President of the National Association Against Police Brutality, recently qualified legal scholar, former law enforcement officer, Jonathan Newton, and a former chief of police,
I will be thy name,
and author, Mr. Jerry Summers.
On earth as it is.
Both have been guests on this show before, and I'm really looking forward to pairing the two of them up this evening, this afternoon, whatever the time zone you might be in,
against us.
As we take on this really important issue of qualified immunity.
The power, the glory, forever.
And talk about what that means in today's society, how that affects you and me, and most importantly, how it allows corrupt police officers to get away with murder.
All those drive-by killers.
Good gosh.
It ain't about nothing. He who was out sin, let him cast the first stone. I'm trying to get this felony off my back so I can get my life on track and have the right to vote and live like an ordinary citizen again. This is my message to all of my friends in the pen, statewide, worldwide. and put down those knives. Stop stabbing each other. Yeah.
So apart from asking questions in the chat room, you can throw your questions in the comments pages as we are on Chat Room Live. Right, I won't keep you waiting any longer. I'm going to introduce my guests. And first and foremost, let me introduce Jonathan Newton. How are we doing, Jonathan?
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. This was your call. This is your topic. This is the show that you wanted to do more than anything else. And I'm so glad to have you. If you could just do us the honor of just telling the audience just a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, what you do, what you've done, and what you're doing.
Okay. First off, thanks for having me. I'm living outside of Washington, D.C. in Largo, Maryland. I'm originally from Key West, Florida. I graduated law school last May of 2017. Prior to that, I was a police officer in the metro Atlanta area in a small police department, but I worked at a sheriff's office prior to going to work for the municipal police department as a public information officer. And I went to law school after blowing the whistle on a sitting sheriff down in Georgia. I was accused of some crimes that were fallacious. When the charges got dropped, I decided to go to law school. While I was in law school, I saw a need for creating an organization that dealt with police misconduct and educating the citizens on knowing their rights during police encounters and empowering the citizens to seek accountability and redress and also change in policy and law. So we started the National Association Against Police Brutality in 2014, in August of 2014. The organization's grown since we've started. We have a small membership base, a paid membership base. We also have attorneys that participate in a referral network that we have that we field when we field incidents and calls from victims of police misconduct. And we do education. So this, what we're doing here on the radio show today with you is part of educating the community and the country, and obviously with your platform, sort of the world about police misconduct, the laws that undergird police misconduct, and how we can change the laws and therefore change the condition of police misconduct and brutality. So that's what I've been doing, and thanks for having me.
That's my pleasure. Now let's just take this over to my dear friend Jerry Summers, former chief of police and author, I believe. Jerry Summers.
Thank you so much, and Jonathan, it's great to be on the show with you. Just a quick summary on myself. I was a chief of police. I'd worked my way up from code enforcement, which was a non-sworn position, through all the chief of police, and I was a chief of police for 8 years. I was terminated from that position when I held my city manager accountable for the laws that average citizens are responsible to follow. For instance, in his instance, he was driving on a suspended driver's license, and I gave him 6 weeks to get it fixed. When he failed to do so, I told him we were going to cite him, and within 2 weeks I was fired. That resulted in a federal lawsuit in federal court on 2 counts of retaliation that I prevailed at. I then wrote the book, Tarnishing the Badge, Why Law Enforcement Officers Are Losing the Public's Trust. And I speak nationally and locally on police issues. I also have an organization called Let's Make It Matter, which, like Jonathan's organization, is a paid subscribership. And we assist people who we believe were wrongfully convicted due to either prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct, and we do so on a pro basis. One of the things I want to remind everybody that Sir Robert Peel said, police are the public and the public are the police. The only thing that differs between the public is the public grants the police authority to remove civil liberty and rights from individuals. In exchange for that authority, they're expected above reproach and at the highest levels of integrity and when they fail to do so, they lose the public's trust.
Yeah, Jerry, we're getting a bit of echo in the background. I'm not sure if you've got the show on in the background or something else going on, but we're having a bit of echo and interference while you're speaking. So as we try and work our way around that, maybe we can try and get a better signal for you and see if we can't stop that interference. So the subject matter and the theme for today's show is qualified immunity. And I'm going to get Jonathan Newton to explain to us exactly what qualified immunity means in layman's terms.
In layman's terms. So qualified immunity is a immunity that's granted to police officers or officers of the state if they are operating in good faith and the law has, if they are operating in good faith, they are granted immunity from civil damages. And it qualified immunity. So in other words, when you sue a police department, you sue an individual officer, the officer can claim qualified immunity if he was acting in good faith, and he has to have not known the law that was the constitutional right that was being violated. So in other words, it seems complicated, even trying to explain it in layman's terms. When laws are clearly established, and that's an entire different definition. When laws are clearly established, an officer can be held liable for his damages if the law is clearly established. And so when laws are not clearly established, then an officer can claim qualified immunity. And so that's the crux of qualified immunity, is if the law is clearly established and the officer still violates the law, he is not going to get the shield of qualified immunity. If the law is not clearly established, he will get the qualified immunity. And so what the immunity does is it basically makes him immune to lawsuit or damages that derive from a lawsuit. Wow.
So who decides whether the officer was acting in good faith or not?
The court looks at, first I should say this, that the court's qualified immunity basically started from the doctrine of good faith. And that was a common law doctrine that if you were operating in good faith as an officer of the law or a government officer, if you were operating in good faith and you broke the law, you constitutionally violated somebody, that you would be granted immunity from the consequences of breaking the law. So qualified immunity was later termed out of the good faith doctrine. So who determines whether the person is inside the scope of qualified immunity or not is a judge after they hear motions and arguments from both parties. Not the public, I should say. Okay.
So the next question we asked then to Jerry is, so who benefits from qualified immunity, Jerry?
Well, ultimately, the government official, I would define it very similar. I agree with Jonathan. Simply, qualified immunity protects government officials from liability of civil damages insofar as their conduct does not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights, which a reasonable person would have known, is another way of putting it. The officer, if the officer violates your constitutional right, he's not going to get qualified immunity, or she's not going to get qualified immunity. But the ultimate protection is to the government official from personal civil liability. And often, even though the individual may be shielded, the organization may not be.
So, Jonathan, just flick back to you very quickly. Can we look at maybe some of the areas that qualified immunity applies to, the laws that you're referring to? You're talking about if the officers were not aware of the law. I mean, so as a layman, as a man on the street, I'm already struggling with this because
I can imagine.
Because if anybody should understand what the law is, it should be a law enforcement officer, right?
That's absolutely right. So if you really look at first off, let's understand where qualified immunity, where we get the terminology from, and understand this. Qualified immunity, you're not going to find a statute that creates qualified immunity. And that's important to know. Qualified immunity is what we call a judicial construction, based on what judges have said. It's basically, it almost has the effect of common law. It's a doctrine that has been created by judges. And so you're not going to find in any federal code book or any state code book that they have a actual definition of what gives qualified immunity. And again, it basically shields officers and government officers from liability of money damages when the violated constitutional right was not clearly established. And so when we get into this discussion about qualified immunity, it should be noted that what is clearly established is not actually known at all times. There are some basic guidelines that the Supreme Court has set that says that is clearly established now. So, for instance, we're not supposed to be shooting off a fleeing suspect in the back, and so that's been clearly established. But you can go from appellate circuit to appellate circuit and find different variations of what is clearly established and what is not. And so when you get into the nuance of qualified immunity, what you're finding is that defense lawyers, when I say defense lawyers, those are the defendants, the officers' lawyers, are making arguments that are very specified in terms of what actually took place factually, to say, well, even though shooting took place and a life was taken, there is qualified immunity applies in this particular instance because it is not clearly established that that particular protection was meant to be given in this specific fashion. And so defense lawyers have been able to expand, and courts have started agreeing with some of this. And they have broadened the scope of qualified immunity, and it's had a negative impact on Section 1983 actions, civil rights litigation. And so this expansion of the scope of qualified immunity has been taking place over the last 20 years. And it's reached the point where citizens like yourself or people who are common, just laymen, are starting to say, well, wait a minute, that can't be right. That really can't be right, that an officer can get away with that and not have any civil damages. And it's important to know also that this just deals with civil damages. It only shields them from damages civilly, right, not a criminal prosecution.
Okay, so at some point after an event, they get to go away and sit down and map it out all out, process map it. We do this stuff at work called process mapping. So they're able to lay out this map of the whole scenario, how it took place. And then somebody's going to say, this is how we get away with this. Is that sort of what we're talking about in a nutshell?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the job of, yes, an attorney will sit down and say, they're not going to say how we get away with this. They're going to try to say how this fits inside the scope of qualified immunity. And if it doesn't fit inside the scope, they're going to make an argument to say that it should fit inside the scope of qualified immunity, unless it's so blatant and apparent that it will not. And oftentimes they'll make the argument just out of spite. And so it clogs up the courts with, frivolous defenses, but oftentimes they do that anyway, and that drags out the length of time that civil rights litigation takes.
So Jerry, as a former chief of police, have you ever had to preside over an incident where an officer under your charge was looking at how he managed to wangle his way around this? I'm sorry, I'm going to use some really unsavory words here. How he managed to wangle his way around the qualified immunity procedure in order to benefit himself?
The short answer is yes, I have. Let me give you the opposite side that Jonathan gave you, so we can just put it all in context. I've also been an officer in which qualified immunity has been exercised for my protection. And let me give you a very simple scenario. My first arrest out of the police academy was for a violation of a protection order. The husband and wife had filed protection orders against each other, and were not supposed to be together. And when I stopped them in the traffic stop, it came out that they both had restraining orders against each other, and they were in violation of it. I wound up arresting both of them. What we found out the next day was that the community in which they lived, which was over 100 miles away from the community I worked in, had quashed one of the protection order. Wife was quashed against the husband, but that was never disclosed. So when I did the radio check and checked in good faith that they were in violation of the protection order, and I checked it twice, I was told yes. I arrested the wife. We turned around and got sued because of the fact that the protection order had been quashed. Under that circumstance, qualified immunity attached, because in good faith, I had no way of knowing. I checked and double checked, and there was no way of me knowing that the order had been quashed by the court. So in that instance, qualified immunity worked, and it worked effectively. Now, it is also works the other way, like Jonathan says, in that an officer does do something wrong, and they claim the qualified immunity as a protection. And ultimately, the court has to weigh the circumstances. Unfortunately, in federal court, the preponderance of evidence goes to the non-moving party. So if somebody is accusing the officer of, and correct me if I get this wrong, Jonathan, because I'm not an attorney, but if the party accusing the officer says that the officer did something wrong, the court has to look at the evidence most favorable to the officer in determining whether or not qualified immunity will work on a summary judgment situation.
Sorry, did you say that the judge would have to look at the evidence most favoring the officer?
So, at that point, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Jonathan, clarify that for us further still.
Okay, so let's look at how an action takes place. Bad situation happens. Shooting happens. The family decides to sue the officer and the municipality that's been involved in the shooting. When they launch that complaint, the defendants are in that situation. The officer and the municipality are going to start mounting their answer. And also, after they're going to answer. They're going to make an answer and say, "Hey, we deny this. We deny this. We deny this." After that, they may file a motion for summary judgment. Now, whoever files the motion for summary judgment has the burden to prove they're entitled to that summary judgment. And so, what happens is qualified immunity is a affirmative defense. So the defendant basically says, "I'm entitled to this immunity." Now it becomes incumbent upon him to prove that he is entitled to it, meaning that he has to make an argument that entitles him to that qualified immunity. In other words, he has to make the argument that the law is not clearly established. So when he makes that argument, whoever is in opposite of the summary judgment, the person who that ruling will be against, the court gives they actually give lenience towards that person. They interpret the facts towards that person. So in that case, it would be the plaintiff who has who's getting the benefit of the doubt, and it becomes incumbent upon the officers and the defendants to make their claim. Anytime, so if the plaintiff moved for summary judgment, right? And now let's flip the roles. The plaintiff is moving for summary judgment, and it's not going to be based on qualified immunity. It can be based on some other thing. Then the plaintiff is saying, "I want to go ahead and cut short the court from doing its job of looking at all of these facts, and I want to just cut short this guy's day in court." Then the court says, "You know what? We're since you're going to do that, then we would accept the officer's rendition, not rendition, but we would give a lenience towards his side." And so what you have there is depending on who asserts the motion for summary judgment, the other person, the opposite party, the opposing party, then has been given more lenience from the court. So that's basically how that works. Again, qualified immunity is an affirmative defense, and so when defendants make that, they're saying, hey, I want to cut short this plaintiff's day in court. And so the court actually gives deference to the plaintiff in that scenario. And the assertion of qualified immunity has to be proven out by the defendant.
Right. So if you had an individual who was who had lost a loved one, so their spouse, their brother, their sister, their mother, their father was involved in an issue, an incident, an event with a law enforcement officer, and happened to lose their life, because that individual is not as fully aware of all the ingredients that make up the case. What took place, what was there, what happened, how did it happen, the sequence that it happened in, etc. They're going to find it very difficult to disprove the officer's version of events on most occasions anyway, aren't they?
That's correct. That's correct. So, I mean, when I'd love for us to, during one of our next shows, I'm going to get one of the a few civil rights attorneys who are actually actively practicing civil rights law and excessive force and police misconduct cases. They'll share with you how difficult it is to prove out one of these cases. There's a national attorney right now who was involved in a very high-profile case back in 2013, I believe it is. And, you know, I see he has ads up now, and people are just trashing him, talking about he's never won a case, And I don't think that most people understand how difficult it is to win one of these cases on the merits. And I mean, when I see on the merits, that it goes all the way through to completion. Most of these cases, when they are there is a favorable outcome, it comes as a settlement. And it is because there's so many different landmines, and there's so many different things that can terminate a case based on the facts. And it's not a fair scenario for a plaintiff. It's not a fair scenario for a victim's family. There's some case that I have of one of our members. He's litigating right now on behalf of his son. And just to see him go through this process, it's been an amazing thing. There's two families that I know. There's a family up in Oregon that's going through the process. And it's a long, exhausting legal battle. And what happens is oftentimes is that most people in the general public do not know of these protections that officers have, and therefore when they see, you know, these outcomes, they're not understanding how an officer was, number one, able to walk away without any criminal prosecution, and number two, walk away without any civil liability whatsoever. And so that's part and parcel why we're here today.
Okay, so Jerry, surely there are enough protocols and provisions and resources and safeguards to protect a police officer in the event of something going wrong, without them having to be given an additional upper hand, surely.
Well, the problem as I see it is kind of twofold. The government, in any case that comes against the government, has the upper hand automatically, because often they control the records, and especially police cases. As a chief of police, I controlled whether I released video, whether we released certain statements, and it's very difficult for a moving party to get control of those or get access to those records. So the defense or the case brought against the officer is stymied by the organization itself ability to cooperate with discovery motions and discovery processes. That's the first step. The second step is that in order for an officer to lose qualified immunity, his behavior has to be grossly negligent, or the organization has to be accused of failure to train, kind of synopsis. So to the moving party, to the injured family member who's lost a loved one, it's an uphill battle to start with. There are protocols, there are procedures, but if the organization And this is what happens in a lot of police organizations because of a lack of transparency. I mean, let's say I decide that I'm in a situation and there's a person of color, and I decide that because I happen to be a white male, I'm going to execute this person of color because I'm racist. I don't believe that's the majority of the case in a lot of law enforcement shootings, although it does play a part. But let's just say, for hypothetical reasons, I decided to kill this person because he was a person of color. What happens internally is there's a twofold investigation that goes on. There's an internal affairs investigation, administrative investigation that goes on by the agency itself that generally determines what civil liability and what liabilities may be attached to this organization as a result of the officer's conduct. The other investigation that goes on is a criminal investigation. It's usually done by an outside source. Now, as a chief of police, I can compel the officer to tell me the truth, or the officer runs the risk of being terminated. And so I can, under what's called a Garrity or a Weintraub warning, I can compel that officer to tell me the truth, and that officer is not entitled to any Fifth Amendment rights, a right against self-incrimination. But as a result of that, I'm also not allowed, or my investigators are not allowed, to share the information we receive with the criminal investigators. The criminal investigators can share their information with the administrative review, but it doesn't go the other way around because constitutional rights are violated. So if I sit down and I meet, if the officer or the administrator sits down with me as the shooting officer and says, "Why did you kill this guy? Why'd you shoot him?" And I said, "Because he's a person of color." Now, realistically, that administrator would fire me on the spot, but that administrator is not allowed to go take that information and give it to a criminal investigator because I was tell the truth without any protections. So what you've got is you've got a system that doesn't communicate with one another. And the criminal investigators required to give me my Miranda warnings and all those rights against self-incrimination, choose not to talk to them. I can't do so on the administrative side. So if I were to come out and out admit on the administrative side that I was racist and I killed the person because I'm racist, they could not share that information with a criminal investigator.
Wow. So let me just we've had a couple of comments coming through. Donna Faye Pincon Chiesi, who I had on the show just a week or so ago, says that police investigate themselves. But Marilyn Kovarubias, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her name right, says human beings' lives are being taken and their lives have not been protected by the Constitution or their civil rights were not taken into consideration. Too many unarmed people have been killed by police officers. Also, they have been caught on camera violating our civil rights, and police brutality, corruption and murder has been brought to light. But now in a lot of states, they are trying to make it illegal to film them to cover up the corruption. And don't get me started on the judicial system. They seem to always take the side of the cops. Just look at the statistics, you will see. Okay, so why is the constitutional rights and people's civil rights, which has been something that has been standing, I suppose, not from the beginning of time, but have been put in place for the very protection of the people, why is that being overridden by this qualified immunity, which seems to not be put in place to protect what is right, but just to be protecting somebody who might have done wrong, if that makes sense?
The real issue to look at here is how much power have we given to courts to create doctrines that are in contravention to Congress's statutory authority. In other words, there's laws on the books. There's Civil Rights Act, the very first Civil Rights Act, 1871. It's also known as the Ku Klux Klan Act. Okay, this act protects citizens from the reign of literally the Klan. and it was put in place to stop sort of the same types of activities that you see happening out of some law enforcement today. And so it was a congressional act, and it protects citizens. Then you have the court actually start creating doctrine, which is, it has the effect of law because it is our Supreme Court. Okay, you have courts that create doctrines that fall in contravention to these congressional statutes that are created. So even though we have on the books protections from Congress, and we have on the books protections that exist in the Constitution, right? Then those protections are often eroded by what we would consider as laymen, or what laymen would consider as basically they were eroded by decisions that either expand the scope of the protections or narrow the scope of the protections. And what I want folks to understand is this: even if you cannot get a piece of legislation out of Congress, our federal government, the next source is to look towards your state government. And states have the authority. First off, the Constitution just sets the basic minimal level of protections that are given to citizens. And so when you say, every citizen is entitled to, we're not allowed to be unreasonably searched or seized, right? Then the courts will play around with, well, what's unreasonable, okay? And so we have this varied scope of what we consider unreasonable, and it's fluctuated back and forth between what type of court we have in place, whether it's a conservative court, whether it's a liberal court, whether it's an activist court, or whether it's a strict construction court, so forth. But if you really want to dial in protections and get to specific protections, I'm not saying don't look to the Constitution. I'm saying it may not be your best source. The best source for the protection would be having your state legislatures create laws that actually we can actually raise the standard of protection at state level, okay? And most citizens don't really understand that, don't know that, Your state is fully entitled to give more protections to you than the Constitution gives. They cannot give less. That would be what we call unconstitutional. But states are entitled to give more protections. And so you do find in some state courts throughout the country, you are able to get a civil rights claim litigated to a successful outcome based on state court law, where on federal court, in federal court systems, you're going to have some problems.
Do do we have any stats as to how many officers have been found failing when applying for qualified immunity, and what grounds they failed in order not to qualify for that qualified immunity? Do we have any cases that we probably can talk about at all?
I don't have any stats in terms of when they do not qualify for the immunity, where they have tried to assert the defense and then they get denied that. I don't have those types of stats in any of my information, but I will say this: most of the time when an officer claims the defense of qualified immunity, most of the time, more than 50%, they will get it. And sometimes it has to do with the fact that, the attorneys that they may not have understood what was clearly established and what was not clearly established inside their jurisdiction. And it's important to know that what's clearly established nationally is different than what's clearly established in each different circuit. And so this is why we have this problem. We do not have a consistent level of clarity when it comes to what's clearly established constitutional rights in this country. And that seems like a very broad statement to make, but I will back that up. You can look at different findings from different circuits, and you will see that qualified immunity means one thing in one circuit and qualified immunity means another thing in another circuit. For instance, in California, it's more liberal. It's a more liberal approach to denying qualified immunity for officers. Where if you go down south and some of the more conservative states, qualified immunity, the scope of qualified immunity has been broadened to include a whole bunch of things that may not be considered clearly established in other areas.
Okay, just very quickly, Donna Faye Pinconchiesi says, let me rephrase, why do we have to file our civil lawsuits for our children's death on federal level?
You don't actually have to file them specifically on federal levels. In federal court, you can choose your state courts to go. Your state courts or courts of general jurisdiction. You can file in there. You can file in your state courts depending on what your state laws, what your state constitutions, what type of protections they provide for you as well. And also, when you talk to local attorneys, they will tell you where you have a better chance of success for your case, whether it be in a federal court or whether it be in a state court. But it's never going to be like you absolutely must file in a federal court system.
Okay, so Jerry, so is the reason behind all of this, or the strength behind all of this, is that the state actually controls the law and what is law? So therefore, the law enforcement officer or those that are petitioning for the qualified immunity are always going to have the upper hand over a citizen who's trying to defend that?
Partially. Let me see if I can put this in a very succinct context. Qualified immunity is meant for the civil protection of government agents or officials that act in good faith and are not grossly negligent in their behavior. That's the scope, the context in which, that's the jar in which we're operating within. Is the first thing. Okay. The problem here comes about that, especially in an officer's standpoint, they must make a very quick decision in a very limited set of times and with limited circumstances, which then gets to be analyzed over years and from various different angles that officer at the time didn't have the opportunity to make that decision on. That's the context. The problem occurs in that when you look at an off-involved shooting or an unlawful death of somebody, the courts and the agencies are going to look at it from what they call a reasonable officer standpoint. In other words, would an officer with the same training, given the same circumstance, act in the same manner? And if the answer to that is yes, then you have a reasonable officer standard. That's what a reasonable officer would have done given the same circumstances they were given. The problem we have throughout law enforcement then becomes the transparency situation where you have an officer that's going to back up another officer regardless of what they do, because that's a cultural and organizational standard. You'll hear it in any locker room in any police agency, and that is, I've got your back, man, or I've got your six, which means that I'm going to protect you regardless of what you do or what you say. And that's where the corruption component comes within a law enforcement agency. And it's a top-down strategy. If the top allows that kind of behavior to go on, you're going to see that corruption infuse the entire organization at every level. And it takes a administrator to say, no, we're not going to allow that, and we're going to start to change that. And unfortunately, an officer is trained from law enforcement academy through chief of police that you're to protect your fellow officer at all costs. And if you fail to do so, then you're considered a persona non grata within that organization, within that industry itself.
Okay, absolutely. So listen, in most businesses around the world, right, we have standard practice, best working practice. We have all of these things that we train ourselves to be to offer a service of excellence, right? So how much more should we expect from police officers, law enforcement officers, to be operating in the most highest standard, with the most highest integrity, based on the fact that they are representing the state, the country, the nation, the crown, the whole establishment of justice, right? How much more should they have to be trained to a higher level to be able to know what those laws are, to know what the parameters and the boundaries are within their job role, that they are not put in a position where they're having to hold their hands up at the last minute and say, hang on a minute, I need a get out clause here. Because that's what, to me, that's what qualified immunity says. It says that this police officer has done something wrong and he now needs a get out of jail free card.
Well, kind of. It's not quite to that. It can be used at that level, but that's not the intention of it. And I don't think we have a training problem. I think we have a integrity problem. That's why I started out the show by quoting Sir Vincent Peale, in that law enforcement officers are given authorities above any other citizen, and where I literally take your rights away, I can take your freedom, and I can act in a manner that will actually result in your death, and do so because of the authority that the citizens in the community have given me. The flip side to that is that the community should be able to expect the highest level of integrity and the officer's behavior and professionalism should be above reproach. The problem we have is that in the entire legal community, we have this qualified immunity and absolute immunity for prosecutors and judges. So what we have here is we have the officer that's given qualified immunity, but now if the officer has done something wrong and the qualified immunity protection has been breached, the prosecutor or the attorney representing them could literally lie in court about what happened, and there is no consequences, or by and large, there's been no consequences to that attorney. Judges tend not to hold prosecutors accountable for misconduct, and prosecutors tend to, ethics committees in bar associations tend not to hold the attorneys accountable for ethical violations. And the reason for that is we've got that same structure throughout. We've got one entity protecting its own members, and the ultimate failure and the ultimate price that's paid is paid by the community. And that's done through a lack of transparency and a lack of adherence to ethical standards and policies and procedures. Police, by and large, have been trained very well. There are very few exceptions where police don't know what they do. They tend to ignore the appropriate protocol, and that's a reality whether we like it or not. And that's why the changes must occur within the organization. The community has to start holding police officers and their administrators accountable. And where the administrators hide is they hide through the lack of transparency and the inability or the laws that prevent them from the truth of what really went on.
Do you know?
Agree.
Yeah. Sorry, did you want to come in there, Jonathan?
Yeah, I agree. I do think that it is largely an integrity issue, but I also agree that it's a training issue. And when I wrote a paper in 2017 called "Watching the Watchers," and I talked about the need for what I call proactive inspection of police departments, policing. And also prosecution, the entire criminal justice system. And I'm going to use the 5 elements of the traditional criminal justice system, which is the police, the prosecutors, the judges, the jailers, and then probation. Okay, that entire system, those entire elements, every component of that system is a closed loop circuit. Nobody has, from the outside, has much way to inspect what is happening on the inside. If you wanted to right now go to your local police department and say, I want to see how many pullovers you have done inside our community and what are the racial breakdowns of those or the gender breakdowns of those pullovers, you're not going to be allowed to see that as a citizen. And so it is through this lack of transparency that creates the environment for us to cultivate this corruption. So the other thing is when we talk about training, and it was one thing that you said at before Jerry was speaking, is that this officer finds himself in a position that he now has to make a life or death scenario, decision. And I want to ask Jerry, you have a lot more experience than I did, but I always thought of, before I put myself in this position, what could be the outcomes and what could be my options based on this particular subject's actions. That's the type of training that I think that we need to see more of, so that officers are not actually in the jeopardy that they say that they are in. Sometimes it's constructed and sometimes it's actual jeopardy. But, you know, we don't really have trainings that say, you know what, if you're going to a house and the subject is a mental illness call, and you get there and this person has a screwdriver in his hand, you know that we're dealing with a person who has a psychotic episode. Why would you run up on him, you know, immediately and then say, I felt in fear for my life and I shot him? That happened in Texas. And so we need to create, and I like to use airlines as an example. Our airline pilots, the types of training that they get, they're not based on, you know, flying in fair weather. They're based on flying in bad weather. They're based on when the engines blow out, like it did 2 days ago. They're based on situations that where everything goes wrong, this is what to do. And I don't think that we depend on our airline pilots to remember those situations. They use algorithms to help with their training. They use checklists to help with their scenarios. And I know the argument would be, well, an officer can't pull out a checklist when somebody is, you know, going off the deep end. The thing is that we have not done training in those scenarios where we're real outcome determinative trainings to walk this thing back to say, at what point could we have changed this outcome from a decision? We have not looked at those things logistically and logically to be able to undo that. But then couple that training with, you know, throughout the entire system, we have no transparency. Even though we have the data, there are situations that we can catch right now. We can catch a bad officer before he really hurts dozens of people, but we're not even proactively looking at the data to be able to do that.
Well, I agree and I disagree in some respects, because I believe the training is there. There's always a higher level of training that can occur, but officers react based upon the way they're trained. We have a continuum of force scenario that is drilled into the officer over and over and over again, monthly, weekly, quarterly, in which calls for, and agencies across the United States have this, which calls for a level of force slightly above what's being presented in order to gain compliance. The problem is officers quickly go from, you know, verbal communication skills, and officers, where I agree with you, Jonathan, is 97% of an officer's job is based on good communication skills, and officers receive about 4 to 8 hours of training in communication skills in the police academy.
Right.
And so verbal skills need to be used a lot more than what they are. The problem we have, though, is if somebody coming towards you as an officer without any weapon in their hand, and they're just walking, and you're trying to get them to stop and they're not complying, you don't know what their intent is. An officer will jump from you know, stop, don't move, to drawing a weapon and shooting in a very short period of time, when there's a whole list of things that are supposed to occur. The officer can retreat. The officer can go to a taser. They can go to OC first, or pepper spray. They can go to a taser, or they can go to a baton, a taser, and then lethal force. And they should step through and go through these escalation steps. Unfortunately, because we don't know what the person's going to do, their immediate responses go to the gun in an effort to get somebody to stop.
Okay,
and once
let me just jump in here, because something just really springs to mind in the midst of all of this. okay? The constant reaction by a law enforcement officer who quickly shouts out that he was in fear for his life when he's facing an unarmed combatant or even somebody who's running away with their back to him, etc., reminds me, or doesn't remind me, just causes me to think of this scenario. Imagine an army who is in defense, and they have the oncoming army that's coming towards them, but their captain, their sergeant, their general, whoever's in charge, says, because this is the protocol, do not fire until I say fire, right? And these guys are all standing there, or they're all sitting there, or they're all down behind their sandbags, or they're doing whatever they're doing, waiting as these people are coming towards them. And sometimes there's all different sorts of noises and stuff going on all over the place. But these guys have got to stand meticulously, precisely in that spot until the captain says, fire. Now these guys, they're in fear of their life. They've got guys coming at them with rifles, machine guns, land to air missiles, grenades, you name it. But they've got to stand there, right, and hold their temperament until their captain, their sergeant, says that you can open fire, right? But you've got an officer who should be trained to the same sort of standard, right? And he's the only one that's normally armed in these scenarios that we're talking about. Again, I'm not going to defend the gangbangers who are running around the streets with guns, who end up getting themselves shot in a confrontation with an officer. I'm not saying that that's right or wrong either. I'm not going to get involved in that. But what we are talking about are these countless, endless scenarios that we're witnessing where unarmed individuals who are not in the pursuit of criminal activity are coming across police officers who are quickly pulling out their guns, emptying out their barrels, killing individuals, and if not calling qualified immunity, there is just absolutely no consequence for them whatsoever, and no one can see any justification. Now, how could they continue to hold up this, I was in fear for my life, when you've got firefighters who are going into buildings where the building's about to collapse and break down? You've got 911 ambulance men, paramedics who are having to go into situations where it's life-threatening because there's still an ongoing scene going on and they don't actually know it's not been safeguarded yet. Sometimes they've just got to go in there because there's a life to be saved, right? How come all of these other professionals could manage this, and yet a law enforcement officer who's given that fundamental authority struggles? I just don't get that.
The simple answer to that, which is that I agree with you. The only caveat there is if you look at a firefighter going into a fire science, and fire has a certain way it reacts, and you can count on the fact that it's going to react that way. When you're dealing with a human being, you do not know how they're going to react. And that is where action always beats reaction. So what happens in a situation where somebody's walking towards you and not saying anything, you don't know what their intention is. Now, logic says the best way to handle that is to give yourself distance, to back away and back off and try to use verbal skills until you see something. The problem is if somebody truly has the intent to harm you and they get within a period of distance from you, they will harm you, and they'll beat you to the punch, if you will, because they already have in their mind what they're going to do and you're second guessing it. So what happens in a scenario like that is the officer automatically is at a heightened fear for their own personal safety. Now, they should use skills. They should use a whole bunch of other things that they don't. But the go-to reaction is, if the person's coming at you, is to draw the weapon and try to get them to stop. The problem is once you've drawn that weapon, it's very difficult to put it back away in the event you get into a physical confrontation with somebody. If you've got the weapon, they're within 2 or 3 feet, and they rush you, now you've created a heightened risk by pulling the weapon out, and you can't go hands-on to them. You've got to make a decision. And that's where a lot of the shootings occur, and that's where the officer claims that he's in fear of his own safety. He didn't know what they were going to do, and then they attacked, or they rushed, or they did something to that effect. The problem is that part of that situation was heightened by the officer's own action. And what happens then is other officers look at the circumstances and say, well, I would have done the same thing, because what you don't know and you don't see are the ones that are going to harm you.
Okay.
So I think that education could really help with those fears that officers have, and education and training. Let's just look at the numbers. You know, the way that the training is done in police academy, and correct me if I'm wrong, this happened in my academy, so I'm wondering if it happens up north. The way that traffic stops are trained is, you don't know what's going to happen. You know, this is the most dangerous situation that you're going to encounter. This in a domestic event. Is that the way that the officers are trained up north, Jerry?
Absolutely.
Okay. So that training right there starts what I call the fear continuum. From the day that guy is trained, he is trained to literally fear every encounter that happens at a traffic stop, every encounter that happens in a domestic scenario, because you're going to be assaulted, pretty much killed. Is that the way that it's trained up in up north as well?
It is. I would not. Where I would tend to differ in your language, Jonathan, is that fear is probably not the right term from my standpoint. What we're told is that any encounter with any individual could be a lethal encounter, and we need to get it through that lens. And
so let's unwind that statement right there too. Every encounter with any person in life could be a lethal encounter.
Absolutely.
So I think that when we train that way, we start a cycle of fear and anxiety in this officer. And so how do we break that cycle? Let's look at the numbers. On an average year, 150 officers lose their life in the line of duty. I'm going to look at Officer Down Memorial page. And we can see from Officer Down Memorial page, year after year, on average, about 150 officers lose their life.
Are you talking
out of those 150? Out of those 150, generally about 50 to 60 are maybe right around 1/3 are lost to gunfire. 1/3 are lost to driving fatalities, and another third are generally lost through heart attacks and health-related issues. So out of the thousands and thousands of officers that we have in the United States, I think the number is well over 900,000. Out of the millions and millions of traffic pullovers and domestic encounters, right, we literally have around 50 or 60 officers a year that lose their life in a scenario with regards to line of duty shootings, fatalities. And so if we were to train properly, I think that we could dispel some of this mythology that exists, that, you know, policing is the most dangerous job and that everybody that you encounter is going to be a potentially lethal scenario. And they're just stop with this fear that the officer goes through these traffic encounters with, and thereby create it more realistic, because you don't make the best decisions when you're driven by adrenaline and anxiety and fear. You know, there would have been nothing for that gentleman down in Texas. This gentleman was unarmed, pants pulled down, he's in his boxers or whatever the hell he was in. His job at that moment was to put his gun away and pull out his taser. If he had to go hands-on with that guy and keep distance away, keep a decent amount of distance in between him and that subject. And if he had to go hands-on with him, call out for backup, go hands-on with him, and hold on to your gun for at least 6 to 7 minutes until the cavalry comes. But we're not training officers that way. You know, we're creating this environment where they're so fearful, and then they fall back to, well, I was in fear for my life, and I had to shoot him. You know, and this is where we're at.
I just want to go into that story, because I did want to go into that story a little bit. And the deputy was Cameron Brewer, right? So I just want to go back to that story, and I just want to read this out so that our audience, those who are aware of it and those who are not aware of it, might familiarize themselves with it as it stands today. So, as we know, I think it was today or yesterday, the deputy, Cameron Brewer, was fired as a law enforcement officer. But let me just read out the report as to the scenario surrounding the incident which led to this law enforcement officer being fired, and then we're going to just open that up for a little bit of a discussion before we move on, right? So it says here, the deputy who shot and killed an unarmed man last month following a confrontation in North Houston was fired late Friday by Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez. The deputy, Cameron Brewer, was terminated for failing to follow the department's use of force policy when he... Now, I just want to emphasize that the deputy, Cameron Brewer, was terminated for failing to follow the department's use of force policy when he shot and killed Danny Ray Thomas on March the 22nd, sheriff officials confirmed. The officer was equipped with a taser, but did not choose to use the electronic stunning device to try and subdue Thomas. The fatal shot, fired about 20 seconds after Brewer ordered Thomas to get on the ground, can be heard on a recording of the confrontation. The officer's dashboard camera did not capture the video of the shooting, and his recently issued body camera was charging in the car when the shooting occurred. Brewer had stopped his patrol unit to investigate an altercation at the intersection of Greens Road and Imperial Valley between Thomas and a passing motorist. And Gonzalez had said Thomas was foaming at the mouth, and the video showed him walking in traffic with his pants down around his ankles. Now, bearing in mind, because this really captured me, right? He was fired, he was terminated for failing to follow the department's use of force policy. Now, somebody please explain to me what this force policy is, and if there is such a thing as a force policy, how come we haven't got hundreds and thousands of officers fired or up on criminal charges for failing to follow the department's use of force policy?
Let me address that one real quick. There is a use of force policy. Every major department and pretty much every department has what's called a use of force continuum. And the use of force continuum basically starts out with gain verbal compliance, if you can. Then you go to a passive compliance, just kind of touching the person. Then you go into hard hands, where you're actually getting wrist lock kinds of things, takedowns. Then you get into uses of force with regard to chemical use of force, batons, tasers, and then ultimately lethal use of force. So there are policies in every established agency that dictates the appropriate responses that you have. The difference, and perhaps the greatest answer to your passionate question, Kervin, is that in this particular agency, the sheriff has taken the position of basically accountability and integrity, and said we had a failure of our officer to follow our policy, and we're not going to tolerate that.
So here's the question then, Jerry. That tells me that every county sheriff or every captain or every man in charge of his unit has the authority to discipline, terminate, or take action against an officer who does not follow the department's use of force policy.
Absolutely.
Correct.
Yeah.
So then, so why aren't we seeing this? Why aren't we seeing this, gentlemen?
You don't see it because of they lack. Some of the leaders lack integrity, and there's political pressures from police unions. So police unions control our state houses. Police unions control police departments through pressure on a mayor. If the mayor doesn't have the backing of the police unions in some of the larger cities, the mayor says, I'm not going to apply too much pressure to a police chief. And then when that pressure is not applied to the police chief, then officers take advantage of that situation as well. So it's integrity, it's political pressure, and then that creates unaccountability.
So here's the thing, gentlemen. Danny Ray Thomas was killed on Monday, March the 26th. We've not even hit 4 weeks yet. There's not been a terrible uproar. This hasn't hit most of the headlines. We definitely didn't hear about it over here in the UK. There weren't no real street protests and demonstrations and outrage around communities, etc. Right? But this county sheriff, Ed Gonzalez, maybe it's the first time he's ever done something like this. I don't know, but I want to take my hat off to him already because he's set a precedent here. Because by using this terminology, right, failing to follow the department's use of force policy, now sends out a message right across the law enforcement that there is a policy in place, and doesn't send it just out to the law enforcement. People are reading this. I'm reading this. We're talking about it, right? There is a force policy, right, that determines what a law enforcement's action should be given a certain situation. And as Jerry pointed out a short while ago, right, so the officer has an option to take out a taser in that scenario. And I think, no, Jonathan, you said it as well. I think it was you who said it. As Danny Ray Thomas came towards him with his pants down, whatever was going on, there was something going on, but he wasn't armed. And he had several options. He could have retreated, waited for backup and support, or he could have used his taser. But he chose to pull out his gun and shoot. And I'm not going to defend this particular officer, Cameron Brewer. But as we were saying off air before we came on, some people might find this to be a little bit controversial. But I'm going to hang it out there, right? Cameron Brewer, right, under those circumstances, in that particular scenario, actually had more to fear than some of his many other counterparts who were shooting unarmed individuals who were not in pursuit of criminal activity in the back as they were walking or running away. It says here that Cameron Brewer asked him to stop twice. He didn't stop. And he may have panicked, which was wrong. And I do believe that Ed Gonzalez did the right thing. And yes, Cameron Brewer was wrong, out of order, and should have been fired and possibly face criminal charges also. But my question has to be, how do you then put this scenario against some of the many others we've seen, Philando Castile and the Alton Sterling and some of the many other big cases that we've heard about, where individuals were unarmed, not confronting an officer, and there was absolutely no sign or evidence of any form of violent confrontation about to take place. Now, how do we compare that? How do we compare that, Jerry?
Well, I think a couple things. I think you see a top law enforcement official demonstrating true leadership. Now, let's understand from the county standpoint, that sheriff is probably getting feedback from the county commissioners because of what he's done. He's come out and said he's violated our use of force policies, and I fired him, which now makes that county liable for the actions of that officer from a civil standpoint, and they should be. Mm-hmm. I mean, the sheriff did the right thing, and what's going to happen within the law enforcement community is some people within that law enforcement community are going to react in a non-favorable manner towards that sheriff. Now, every agency has the ability to do that, and every agency should do that. And with the appropriate amount of transparency, every agency or agency leader would be forced to do that. The reason they're not forced to do that is that they don't have to be open. They don't have to be open and honest and transparent. In this instance, the sheriff was. He said, our officer violated, and he did so within a very short period of time. He looked at the use of force continuum, said they violated it, and we're not going to stand for that in this particular organization. Wonderful. That's the way it's supposed to work.
It's quite obvious, right, that the dash cams and the body cams were all looked at quite quickly. It's quite evident that an internal investigation was carried out quite quickly. It's quite evident that conversations and discussions was had on various levels quite quickly, and this was all done quite quickly after the event. How do we then speak to those individuals who have lost loved ones, who are waiting months, some of them even years, for information, documentation and confirmation as to what took place and how their loved ones lost their lives at the hands of a police officer? It's quite obvious that there is a system. You see, what this throws up for me is, when you see all these other previous cases where people are waiting so long and they're waiting months and months to get something back, and they're going backwards and forwards to the state officers, etc., trying to find out, what the information, and they're being, pushed back and pushed back. But here we're seeing a very quick reaction. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I did a show with a woman by the name of Yolanda McNair. Her daughter, Adacia Miller, was killed by an off-duty cop at his home at a party the day before her 25th birthday. She was actually out celebrating her birthday with a friend. The friend was invited to the party and brought her as a +1. And apparently within between 25 seconds and 20 minutes or something like that, I can't remember the exact timings because it wasn't precise. It was in between those times of her walking in. She was dead, shot dead by the gun. And I remember you was available at the time, Jerry. You were messaging while that show was going on live, and you pointed out that there was two things: the officer shouldn't have been in possession of his weapon while he was at a party drinking alcohol, and secondly, dancing is considered a sport, so he shouldn't have had his gun in that scenario either. And there are clear indications that that particular officer has breached certain protocols, but yet there is no justice for Adacia Miller. How do you tell Yolanda McNair, right, that Ed Gonzalez has so quickly responded to this particular case, and that there is all these protocols and policies in place to protect him? That's what he's done, and that's what he's responded to, but yet there is no justice for her. And there are many other mothers and family members and people who have lost loved ones in similar scenarios, who are waiting for that kind of justice. How do we tell them that there's a fair process taking place here?
I can't. That there is a systemic problem in law enforcement, and it's a systemic cultural problem within the law enforcement industry. There are protocols in place, as you pointed out, Kervin, in which barring very extreme circumstances, an administrator or an official, a chief, a sheriff, can determine whether or not there was wrongdoing by their officer within a 6-month period. We can go through that investigation and determine whether or not there were policy violations or whether the actions were appropriate. And the reason it doesn't happen, and the reason a lot of this doesn't come out a lot earlier, is because internally they know something's wrong, or they know something is highly questionable, and they stonewall and they don't release the information. And that's the systemic problem that we have within law enforcement, within that blue wall of silence, or that wall of silence, or the blue line of of cover up. And Ed Gonzalez shows very clearly that the policies are in place, and it can be determined very quickly in most circumstances. And barring some extreme circumstances where there's really unusual situations, and an answer can be derived at. And I can't think of one where the answer can't be arrived at within a year. So there should never be a situation where people wait years and years and years to never get the true answer. The only thing that I can tell you is if something is not coming forth, there's a reason it's not coming forth.
Yeah, I echo that.
And it's unfortunate. And the only way that's going to change is for laws and governmental changes in our in the United States, which require transparency. Open records is what Jonathan was saying earlier, and those open records have to extend from law enforcement through through prosecution.
Yeah, go on. Go in, Jonathan.
I echo that. It's I always there was a simulation that was done up here in DC on a panel discussion where we simulated, and it was 5 participants. Myself, I played the role of a community activist organization. Another person played the role of a chief of police. Another person played the role of a mayor. And we simulated a bad situation. And here's the one thing that we came up with. If it was dispositive that it was a quote-unquote good shooting, justified, a legally justifiable shooting, families would know about that. The public would know about that within 48 to 72 hours generally, okay? So if we're able to clear, and it's like what Jerry said, barring situations that are extraordinary, right? If we're able to clear a shooting or a police shooting, these aren't anomalies that involve a lot of unknown factors. We know we have the access to video, we have access to the police dispatch recordings. We can get sometimes we can get eyewitnesses who are on the scenes. These are shootings, these are cases often that should be able to be cleared faster than 6, 7, 8 months. I would say they should be able to be done within inside of 90 days if there's a priority placed on them. And that's what I think is the issue. Most of the time, if the officer is not, this is not something that's going to be just a cut and dry, hey, he had a good shooting. They drag this thing out, and they want this to fall out of the public limelight. They want the family to get weakened and just battered down to the point where they're not really looking to move forward. And so if there's a real priority put on officer-involved shootings, they should be able to clear those shootings within inside of 30 to 60 days, 90 days at the tops. That's just what we're looking at. I mean, we're able to determine all kinds of other scenarios that have a whole lot of more elements and factors, cars, wrecks, all kinds of things that have a whole lot of other factors that are involved, and just not having the importance put on the priority placed on these. The other thing that we don't really seem to have is we don't really have an independence of these investigations, and this is a very important issue. Police departments, sheriff's offices shouldn't be investigating their own shootings. The state should not be investigating their own shootings. There's another activist, his name is Mike Bell. I applaud him in his effort to bring forward a structure and a system very much like what's done when an airline situation, the NTSB comes in, the National Transportation Safety Board comes in, and they do an independent investigation. Every police incident that takes place in America involves issues of civil rights and it involves due process. Those are federal issues. We should have sort of a uniform use of force, a uniform force continuum across this entire country. But we don't. We've left that up to states to determine sort of, what is acceptable when it comes to use of deadly force. And that's been to the detriment of our citizens. So I hope that, we can increase the transparency. I would like to see citizens, the victims' families particularly, have a right to be involved in the investigation from day one. If not the actual family member, a personal representative of the family member needs to be involved with the police investigation from day one. Because that family, in my opinion, has standing to be able to make sure that that investigation is being conducted in an upright and objective manner. And without that family's participation or a personal representative of that family, we can no longer simply trust what the police bring us back and say, this is what it is.
I'm probably going off just a little bit, but this has caught my attention, and I really just kind of wanted to share with you guys very quickly while we're on this subject. I'm not sure if you are aware of the case revolving around Kim Groves back in 1994. Because now the New Orleans officials have now reached a settlement with the children of Kim Groves. She was the 9th woman woman murdered on the order of a police officer.
Wow.
And he was a corrupt officer. He was actually running a protection racket for the drug dealers down in the area, and she witnessed him beating up on one of the young guys and filed a civil suit against him, or a complaint against him. It was meant to be anonymous and secretive, but he got to find out about it, and he ordered her death.
Wow.
But yeah, the lawsuit against him, the cop's name was Len Davis, 23 years ago, 24 years almost, was held back while he continued to pursue appeal after appeal against his conviction. So the family have had to wait 24 years for their justice, even though he was sentenced a long time ago. The guy who actually pulled the trigger, Paul Hardy, was sentenced to life back in 2011. But you imagine how much would that family had been through in that 24 years, and that was brought to my attention by Donna Faye Pincon, Cheersy, and she's very agile and very vigilant on today's show, sending umpteen messages. But she sent me that one, and I just had to have a look at that. And seeing that, I'm just beginning to wonder what that family could possibly have gone through, over the last 24 years in their pursuit of justice for their murdered mother, because it's the children that carried on the fight. Jonathan, what are your thoughts on that as you hear that?
It's just incredible. I mean, to allow the courts to deny justice to this family that long, it's incredible. We really have a lot of work to do with our criminal justice system here in America.
The FBI, sorry, Jonathan. The FBI were already targeting Davis and many of his other officers, and had wiretaps on them. So they already knew the depth of the involvement.
They already knew. I mean, and so this is, you get into areas where the FBI is choosing what's the bigger fish in this scenario. They probably wanted to get more people than one or two officers, or whoever it was. But I mean, if the government actually knew that this was the scenario, why wasn't it just settled? This
why did they have to wait 24 years? There's no way Davis and his band of merry men.
And I guarantee you, if you take and you draw out a chain of decision makers who are in that chain of decisions, you're going to find somebody along those lines. There's either some racial bias or some gender bias or something that said, let's just make these people suffer some more. They're not deserving of what we call justice in America. There's a family would not have to wait that long under any normal circumstances, particularly given the overwhelming amount of evidence that the FBI already had that this was something that was completely unacceptable.
First of all,
go ahead, Jerry.
First of all, that kind of action cannot be allowed without enormous corruption.
Yeah.
With that, and I want to go back and answer something that Jonathan said too, with regard to investigations. There are agencies throughout the United States. Las Vegas is one of them. When on any police shooting, their average response to get the information back to the community is 84 days, and a non-fatal incident with police is about 106 days. So it's absolutely possible. There are national standards. You'll find the standards through the International Chief of Police and the National Sheriff's Association, where there are national standards for use of force continuums and those kinds of things. The problem is that they're not being adhered to, and agencies are doing exactly the type of thing that we saw in New Orleans that you brought up, Kervin, in that there was corruption and widespread corruption, and everybody covering their backside as they go along. That's why I got drug out 24 years before they finally got through it all. And many of those people have retired and moved on before somebody comes back and says, no, this was inappropriate.
Do you know, I suppose we could probably spend hours on end digging right through this and coming up with all the negatives and all of the cases, and quite rightly so. And I think there's many more stories to come. And I've been doing Issues Today here on World Jam Global Radio for just over 3 years now. And there's not a week that goes by that we don't hear a story that just turns my stomach. But I want to start looking, as we're heading towards the home straight of this show. We've got about 25 minutes left. That there has to be some positives. We've got guys like you, Jonathan Newton. We've got guys like you, Jerry Summers. We've got guys like Alex Salazar. All three of you are ex. There's Cheryl Dorsey. There are ex-officers, law enforcement officers, who are now coming forward and working towards reform. And getting themselves together, whether it be voluntary or setting up organizations in order to get some sort of communal support going forward. But there is a movement going forward, isn't there, Jonathan?
There is. We're in the process right now of trying to put together a national march. It's going to be called March for Their Lives, and we're talking about the lives of those that have been affected by police misconduct, police brutality, excessive force. We're designing that out right now as to how that's going to look. We're looking for organizations to be involved with us. You can go to www.preventpolicebrutality.org and sign up and get in our system, and we'll contact you. There's also some laws that we would like to push, and when I say like to push, we have policy suggestions that you can take it and put into your communities and say, hey, we'd like to see these put in place. One of the things that happened over the last month with the shooting in Parkland, you're able to see young people come together across America and talk about how they want America to look, and with regards to gun control. And whether you agree with them or not, one of the things that I do agree with is that it's going to take something like that when I say something like that, I'm talking about that level of organizing, that level of awareness. We have not had that. Even though we had Black Lives Matter over the last 3 years, we have really not had a substantive conversation around the policies that exist around police misconduct. And therefore, since the policies and the laws still allow this stuff to go on, the conditions will still go on. And so until we really begin to make it a litmus test for our elected officials, various things that we desire to see put in place. I, for one of my things that I'm constantly pushing, I think that corruption starts at the very base level of writing a report in a police department or a sheriff's office. If you have wrote a fraudulent, a false report, and I'm not talking about making an error, I'm talking about where it's completely devoid of any facts and reality, based in reality, I think you should face a mandatory minimum sentence in prison.
Yeah.
And so you start this type of environment, that there is going to be accountability. We catch you in when police officers write reports, those reports actually have the weight to be able to change somebody's life, sending them to prison, denying them probation. And one of the common threads that we find through a lot of these scenarios is officers come back and they give you a completely fallacious rendition of the facts. And the video controverts those facts. And so what we're saying is we want mandatory minimums for officers. We would like to see a public registry of all of the bad cops in the country. And when I say a public registry, we want to know what the charges were. We want to know what the findings were. The situation like out with Daniel Holtzcloth out in Arizona, right? We should be able to stop somebody like that from being out there if we can actually see that there's been a history and a pattern and a practice that this particular type of officer continues to do. We can mitigate some of these situations before they even happen, or after they happen. We can stop them from having the broader impacts in folks' lives. But we have to really get organized, and that organization is going to have to take place across cultures, across races, across socioeconomic backgrounds, across religious beliefs. We're going to have to say, and it be serious. One of the things that I've seen happen in the last 3-4 years that I've been involved with this is the fragmentation of folks working together to be able to create the type of change that we need. One thing can be said. When a bad officer does whatever he's going to do to you or your family member, he is going to have a unified mechanized, financed organization behind him. Yeah. Period. To go to bat for his defense. That police union is going to make sure that he has a defense that's going to be able to drag people out for years. And so we need something that stands in contravention to that. We need to be unified. We need to be organized. And we need to be mechanized, and we need to be financed so that we can begin to change the laws. It is not going to happen because we have people crying. It's not going to happen because we have people who are sad. It's going to happen because people have said enough of this. We're going to change the law. And I do want to applaud the folks out in California during this last 2 weeks. They have written laws that have they're now passing laws that actually are starting to hold police at a higher level of accountability. That needs to become the model across the country. And state after state, you may not be able to get it in some of the more conservative states, but you can start getting it in some of the states that say they want to be progressive. Let's see if they want to be progressive.
Jonathan, the laws, I agree with everything you've said, except the fact that we have laws in place that are supposed to do that. I mean, if an officer writes a felonious report, Brady itself, Brady versus Maryland, and that gets discovered in the court, should be enough to handle it. It's not. They're not being infected.
Yeah.
So what
they have it, but what I'm saying is the penalty is so. For instance, a Brady issue is if it just means that was exculpatory evidence that wasn't turned over to the defense. But what I'm talking about, when we have these shootings like the gentleman down in South Carolina with Walter Scott, Mike Slager, his report that he gave was completely felonious. He would be the charge already exists of false statements. That's what it would be. It would be a false statement under state law, right? What I'm saying is if you're a police officer, there should be a mandatory minimum sentence for you specifically. We give enhancements to folks who are gang related. We up their sentences because they're gang related. We should give an enhancement to an officer of the law who chooses to write a felonious, a false statement in their reports. That's all I'm saying.
And let me finish. What I was saying is that even under that, what is supposed to occur in a situation that when you have a false statement made, either in a written report or in testimony, that credibility of that officer should be disclosed to every other defendant thereafter, and effectively they become Brady dead, so the organization must fire them. What we have is we have situations in place where these kinds of behaviors are overlooked throughout the entire system, and the officer is not held accountable. Therefore, you don't get rid of the bad officer. With regard to a national organization for bad officers, there was a place that was done through the Post Academy directors for decertified officers, and they established a nationwide database. And yet now only 3 or 4 states, all 50 said they wanted this database, and only 3 or 4 states are the ones that actually continue to give information of their decertified officers within that national basis. So that system's kind of died out, and because the federal agency wanted to take responsibility for it. What happens is there are mechanisms in place right now that are not being enforced, and if they were enforced, we wouldn't be having the kind of issues we're having, and you wouldn't need to be calling for a mandatory minimum of a failure. We've got false statements, we've got obstruction of justice, we have all kinds of laws that are in place that can be used. The problem is the court system, the legal system, and the actual law enforcement industry is not enforcing their own regulations upon themselves. And the only way to find about that, I believe, is to enforce laws that are going to require transparency throughout the organization. Agencies are going to have to start being transparent about the kind of personnel actions they've taken against officers that are accused of wrongdoing. They're going to need, at the end of the investigation, they're going to need to disclose what their findings were and what their actions were.
Okay, so going back, right, again, what needs to be done is standardized good working practice, shared practice. That's what businesses do across the world. So Mercedes out there in Germany, they find something that improves the braking precision of a vehicle. Yes, that's going to be on their cars first, but very soon that particular precision response is then shared out to other companies who can put something similar onto their vehicles. Maybe not at the same standard or expense, right? But shared practice is a good thing. And going back to Ed Gonzalez in Harris County, Texas, who used this term. He was terminated for failing to follow the department's use of force policy when he shot and killed Danny Ray Thomas, right? Tells me that there is a standard practice that can be used across the board in every state. And every officer that did not follow the department's use of force policy should be facing the same consequences as the Deputy Cameron Brewer. And anything falling short of that must be investigated by an outside agency, because having law enforcement investigate law enforcement doesn't work.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love how you keep using the analogy of businesses, with their shared practices. Businesses share practices because they want the best outcome.
Absolutely.
They want to increase profit. They want to increase efficiency. They want to be known as the best of the best. I dare to say that the same cannot be said of every police department in the United States. There are police departments in the United States that have environments and cultures of corruption, and they don't want to have anybody involved in their business at all. And so, therefore, these agencies, if you can even look down there at Harris County, I'm really happy to see that sheriff did that. I'm pretty sure that's Harris County, Texas.
It is.
The same where that Harris County, Texas is the same place, if I'm not mistaken, where a female deputy stood by while her husband choked to death a subject on video after an altercation. Now let's see, trial is set. I'm reading it right here. Trial is set for deputy and husband charged in Denny's chokehold death. It happened back in 2016, but those are the types of that prior to this, I'm seeing that this sheriff clamped down. Prior to this situation, Harris County was out of control. I'm pretty sure I could pull up several things that have been happening down in Harris County, Texas.
Talking about business again, Jonathan, I just want to go into this very quickly, right? So I work for a company that has worldwide interest. Okay, I don't need to put it on here, but we make the fuel tanks for Jaguar Land Rover, and so therefore we have companies and businesses all over the world, and we have departments, different departments, the technology departments, the IT departments, the production departments, the manufacturing departments, the maintenance and process engineering departments. We have them all traveling all over the world to the different companies in the different countries that are doing good practice work and taking a look at what that is and bringing it back and implementing it at their local plants. So therefore, if you've got a department, whether it be Harris County, Texas, or whether it be somewhere else, that's conducting a good force and they're beyond repute and their integrity is of a high standard, why aren't we sharing that same best practice? Because who is the customer here? The people, the people are the customers of law enforcement. People often take offense when we say, "Oh, we're paying your wages." People say that to local officials, right? It's a constant bugbear. We say, "Hey, we paying your wages, man. So you need to do what we tell you," kind of thing, right? But we are. Our taxes are paying. Yeah. We are the customer. We are the paying customer, right? So therefore, we expect a service of excellence, nothing short. And when you're talking about a service that could likely end my life, I expect it to be of the highest repute, So therefore, if you've got to go to over there, I mean, me and Jerry had this conversation some time ago, I think you opened it up with Robert Peel and the fact that that's how the constabulary was established here in the UK, and that was a template that was used to develop community policing in America. Well, if that's the template that was used, why aren't we following that good practice? Why isn't that still being meted out and replicated state to state? Why isn't it being monitored, audited? And to make sure that it continues to hit those high peaks and those high levels that is expected of such a service where life and death is in the hands of an individual.
Because the institution and the industry doesn't look at that way. One of the things, Chief of Police, I used business practices. I came with customer service recovery systems and all those kinds of things. And law enforcement, by and large, looked at me like I was crazy and that I shouldn't be doing it. Ultimately, what's happening is this is the law enforcement, this is what we do, and that's them, that's what they do. And you're right, that separation between the community ultimately being the stakeholders in law enforcement has been lost. And law enforcement does not want them to get that back. And until they do, and one of the ways I keep coming back to it, one of the ways that the stakeholders, the community, the taxpayers are going to get the kinds of service that they'd want is through transparency of the operations within the organization. In other words, knowing what the officer's doing, knowing what their supervisor's doing, and knowing what the head of that agency is doing. So in other words, as a head of the agency, if I am not disciplining and firing officers for violation of use of force continuum, and the community knows about that, the community is going to fire me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And they should. At this point, the community does not get that information ever. They don't get the information at the officer level. They don't get it at the middle management level, and they certainly don't get it from the administration. So there's no checks and balances.
I'm participating in a project with some colleagues of mine. We're actually trying to get every SOP manual throughout the entire country for every police department. Standards of procedure. I keep using that. So that we can make a working PDF of it so that citizens can look up and see what an officer is supposed to do by his own by the policy guidelines of the department that they're a part of. Knowing what somebody is supposed to do is the very first step of being able to empower yourself to hold them accountable. A lot of citizens don't even know what their rights are when it comes to being pulled over in traffic. You've had folks who are literally fighting the police when the officer asked them to get out of the car. And it's just because they don't know that they actually have to get out of the car, if he has a reasonable basis for making the stop safe, But, it's really, we should be talking about instituting mandatory practices throughout police departments. Baltimore, when the DOJ went up there and did their investigation of the city of Baltimore, this is certainly after the Ferguson report came out as well, you see practices that are taking place in large metropolitan police departments that, after it's said that this has happened, we put them under a consent decree, then we put, an oversight committee that's there, and a lot of times what happens is these oversight committees really don't have a lot of power. They have power through the courts to be able to say, hey, they're in violation of the consent decree, but, they don't have a lot of power to be able to remove bad apples or bad officers from amongst the ranks. And so we have these conditions that continue to exist. I hope that throughout the next year or so that we're able to get together and talk about a comprehensive plan to be able to reform police culture throughout America. We really need to really get together and say, hey, this is exactly what we think a model should be, and start targeting police departments that we believe that we can achieve change with. Every police department is not as open to a change as some of the others are, but there are starting to be police chiefs that are saying, hey, you know what, I want to do the best thing, and they're willing to put their career on the line and say, hey, I'm going to step out here and I'm going to try this with organizations that are looking towards progressive policing. And we thought that was going to happen during the Obama administration. I think the ball just got put on the table at that point, was to have the conversations about 21st century policing and so forth. That was more of a response as to what was happening, as opposed to a long-term plan of what should be happening continually. And we do need what I consider to be proactive inspection of police departments at all times. You know, when an airplane takes off, before the airplane takes off, somebody is constantly reviewing the systems that are in place of that airplane, because you have lives involved. You know, with policing, we don't actively or proactively inspect our police departments. So therefore, we don't know if an officer's having a bad day. He just got into a domestic violence incident with his wife or whatnot. He shows up to work, he sits in the squad room, and the next thing you know, he's out patrolling the streets. And so we need to be able to have systems that are put in place that proactively inspect and look for situations before they occur. The data is already there. Every stop in most major cities, when the stops are taking place, they're recorded through a computer-aided dispatch system. We can begin to look and see, is an officer only pulling over females? You know, is an officer only pulling over black subjects? Is an officer only pulling over black males? And so therefore we can be able to see those patterns and address those things before they become an issue. And I'd like to see more of that stuff take place.
Wow, that's a great foresight, Jonathan. We're running into the last couple of minutes. Jerry, how can we see more accountability? Just in a couple of minutes, round it up for us.
Well, everything that Jonathan has said, the data's there. You're absolutely right. But it's going to require a transparency where the community is able to view what's going on within the department. And until that happens, you're going to continue to have this kind of systemic corruption and the systemic cover-ups, if you will, that are going on. The problem is it's a long-term result of ongoing behaviors and practices. And whenever, and I'm a firm believer, whenever you're able to do something in the dark and it's not exposed to the light of public scrutiny, you have a circumstance that's ripe for corruption, and we see that within the law enforcement and legal community, not only in the United States, but also in the UK.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And just one last thing, Jonathan. How do we stop qualified immunity becoming justified murder?
Wow, that's a big chunk. At the state level, you can set up guidelines that said this is what's clearly established in our state. It's clearly established that it's unlawful to shoot an unarmed man, and go ahead and lay out the scenarios. Unarmed man who is not facing me yet. So once you do that, once you clearly establish the law in that particular jurisdiction, now qualified immunity no longer applies.
Absolutely. Well, listen, gentlemen, once again, I want to thank you very much for taking part in today's show. We're going to catch up again real soon. I know we are, because there's so much more left undone. And remember, Deputy Cameron Brewer was terminated for failing to follow the department's use of force policy, which tells me that there's already a standard in place that every force across the country should be following in order to safeguard its peoples and its communities. So I take my hat off to Ed Gonzalez, and we'll be keeping our eyes firmly fixed on the outcome of this. But for today, I just want to thank Jerry Summers, former Chief of Police and author, and the President of the National Association of Action Against Police Brutality, legal scholar and former law enforcement officer, Jonathan Newton, for a very, very challenging and enthralling discussion. Thank you very much, guys. We're out of here.
Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. In the day, I didn't really care about the system. It was all about survival. It was do or die. I had too many rivals. I was too young and foolish to stay in school. I learned my lessons in the streets. There was not a man I couldn't beat. I was good with my hands and very quick on my feet. I was swimming in women. I had girls all over the street. I was getting money. Life was so sweet. Now things have changed. The whole game is getting rearranged. I'm a changed man. Don't need no gun in my hand. It ain't about about being no gangster. Life is too short to spend it all in jail. Trying to cope with this living hell. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. Already did my time, I paid for my crime. I was a drug dealer, sold more drugs than Superfly, but I never got high on my own supply. I'm not proud of what I had to do, that's why I'm telling my story to you and you. I had to repent, I must admit, I was doing all kind of stupid shit. Now I sit back and think it over since I've gotten older. The life I used to live, I wouldn't do it again. I was young and dumb, my brain was so numb. I was a real Forrest Gump, but I was nobody's chum. Me and Billy the Kid had a lot in common. I was the real Terminator, much meaner than Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd chew you up and spit you out like a real alligator, especially all you haters.
The opening statements are going on right now. He could be saved.